All right, class. Hello there. I hope you're doing well. I'm currently recording this video next to my sick child who is on the way to sleep right now, but he's not quite out yet. And he may make some strange vocalizations or something during this video. We'll hope we can get through it without him deciding that it's done. But in the event that he makes a noise, please don't mind it. So to talk about V for Vendetta, we're going to start with, first we're going to talk about how to read a graphic novel very briefly. And then we're going to discuss some key themes and points that are throughout the text. And then we'll take a look at, very quickly, the volumes themselves and mention some important stuff to note, that sort of thing. So the first thing we want to talk about is how to read a graphic novel. A graphic novel is like a fancy way of saying comic book. It consists of panels. They go left to right. And there are different text bubbles which can indicate different um, clues about what's going on, either speech or directions or changes of scenery, or a lot of times they'll use a different type of word bubble if something is coming from an electronic source, such as a television. So there are some contextual clues that you're going to have to pick up on while reading these texts. And some of you may have a lot of experience with reading graphic novels, comic books, manga, that type of thing. But a lot of people, I think this is kind of a new medium. I do like it as a medium because I think one of the things that we get from it is the powerful images themselves. The composition of the images in this text in particular is very beautiful, in my opinion. Hopefully you feel the same. And there's a lot of subliminal signaling and stuff that goes on in these images, so you'll want to pay as much attention to the images as to the actual text itself. Barring that, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. There is a big uptick for the use of graphic novels in not only high school and middle school settings, but also college as well. It is a more intricate art form than people realize. I think the idea that it is just produced for pulp entertainment is rapidly diminishing, and people are starting to take this medium a lot more seriously, which is good in my opinion because I like using it. Okay, so some key themes to talk about with this text: the superhero and the anti-hero trope. So there's a character V. He's just named V. We don't know his real identity. And he has the qualities of both a superhero, meaning superhuman strength and abilities, and an anti-hero, meaning that he occupies a similar textual role to a protagonist, but he actually has questionable morality, and he skirts on the edge of hero/villain. So he's a very complicated character, and he's one of the reasons why this text is so interesting. Because you find, much in the way that you sympathize with the devil in Milton's Paradise Lost, you find yourself sympathizing with V, because the government that he's rebelling against is so terrible that in a way, his actions, although they are destructive and really not what we would consider right, they seem justifiable in a way, or it's hard not to relate to him, and it's hard not to sympathize with him, not only for you, but also some of the characters in the story that are on the other side of the fence. So that's really interesting. Now, the superhero trope, of course, is the idea that he's super strong, he has superhuman strength and abilities, and so that's a new element, right? What does that bring to the table? Well, I think there's a level of idealism that's associated with superhero stories that we're going to see in this text, and we really need to talk about it since it is so overtly political. What does this superhero idealism mean in conversation with the political themes of the text, which I think is very interesting to talk about. So the next thing we need to know about, and you may have heard this before, but V for Vendetta is a dystopia. It is a dystopian novel. So a dystopia is the opposite of a utopia, and it contains many of the same themes as other dystopian works, such as 1984, which if you took my 1101, we read 1984, George Orwell's famous dystopian text. Also, The Hunger Games, a very popular series of modern movies, that is also dystopian. So dystopian themes, utopia is a perfect society. A dystopia is like a horribly imperfect society, a society that no one wants to live in. And dystopian themes include, but are not limited to, a post-apocalyptic environment, constant surveillance or being watched, a totalitarian government controlling the people, a state of poverty or substandard living for most people, and a breakdown in human relationships. Um, People can't really relate to each other because of the social imposition that's put upon them. Uh, so, sorry, my child is awake. Dystopias serve to warn us of what the future might look like if we don't get it together. So they aren't meant to depress us, although they sometimes do, but they're really meant to show us, like, if you don't fix the problems that are in your society, what is the society going to look like 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line? Of course, Orwell's 1984 was written as a prediction of what the future would look like if the post-World War political movements went in the direction that Orwell thought they were. And of course, he wasn't right on the money when 1984 came around. It wasn't quite the dystopia that he outlined, at least for most of the world. But as we get closer to technology and things like domestic surveillance and smartphones and all that stuff come into play, George Orwell starts to become more relevant. And by virtue of his relevance, texts like V for Vendetta are more relevant as well. I don't think that V for Vendetta, The Hunger Games, any of that stuff would exist were it not for the themes set forth in 1984. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about fascism. Fascism is a political ideology. The government in V for Vendetta is fascist. So it's totalitarian in essence, usually exalts a certain type of strong person as being the ideal member of society. So the worth of individuals, then, of participants in the society, is judged by their relationship to that ideal. Those who embody the ideal are valued. Those who do not are either marginalized or, as the case was Nazi Germany, they are exterminated, forced into labor camps, etc. So Nazi Germany was fascist, Mussolini's Italy was fascist. There have been other fascist governments. The term fascism is used a little more liberally today in the American political sphere especially, but it is a problem. And fascism does rear its ugly head, especially during moments when a society is in decline. That is when a fascist can really gain traction because he'll use that ideal as a way to like rejuvenate society. And so the members of the fascist government are often people who are invested in the status quo and they see their way of life as being threatened. And so they feel like they need to cleanse society. They need to act out and to force society back into its ideal form where, of course, they maintain power. So it is a very, very awful system of government and makes most of the people that live under it miserable. And actually, many of the fascists themselves end up being miserable. In V for Vendetta, the fascist government is called Norse fire. So Norse being a sort of term that refers to the Nordic peoples of Northern Europe. And it's an allusion to Hitler's obsession with Nordic culture. A lot of people don't know that the swastika as a symbol is actually a Nordic symbol, and it has a long history in Indo-European cultures before Hitler came around and used it as his symbol. But he did so because it was used by the Nordic peoples, and so he wanted to create a symbol that represented basically whiteness or the Germanic race, right? So, of course, in this text, the fascist government has horribly racist tendencies. They are very intolerant towards anyone, as I said previously, that doesn't fit that ideal mold. In this case, the ideal mold is the white Englishman. In the text, unfortunately, most of the minorities have either been imprisoned, sent to work camps, or exterminated. In fact, many of them had experiments, like genetic experiments and stuff, conducted on them, like guinea pigs, which happened in World War II. Very dark subject matter, fascism, but it is nevertheless something that we always need to keep our eye on because, it's not really a system that anyone wants to live under. There are some comments on masculinity, like in Fight Club. This text addresses the issue of masculine insecurity and identity. The Supreme Leader, Chancellor Susan, is likely a virgin, and despite his stern demeanor, he is lacking in his manhood. Also consider his last name, which is generally a woman's name. In addition, the character Louis Prothero has an obsession with dolls. Very strange. He collects dolls, like porcelain dolls, which is not something that you would expect a military man to do. So it's a comment on his inadequacy, and also his I say inadequacy because he's posing as a masculine character, and yet he has these traditionally feminized traits like collecting dolls. So he doesn't even live up to his own standard, is what I mean by that. Uh, so this sense of masculine inadequacy is kind of alluded to as a reason for why these guys are so screwed up. They don't feel like they're supposed to in their mind, like men. So they have to take it out basically on the society at large. And I think that ties in with what we talked about in Fight Club, about the characters having their masculinity threatened on a regular basis. And that's why they decided to create the Fight Club and go beat each other up, right? Because they had to exert themselves in some way. All right. The absentee father again comes up in Fight Club. The narrator and Tyler Durden had absentee fathers. In this text, we see Evie, the text's she's the true protagonist. She's a young woman who basically is abandoned not only by, well, her family, her mother dies, her father's captured as a political prisoner. We can only assume he's dead. She's sent to an orphanage and stuff. So she's been abandoned not only by her circumstances and losing her parents, but also by the society at large. So she's always looking for a replacement to fill the void left by her father's political imprisonment. And this may explain why she ends up taking up with the character V, who is a terrorist. But she is so desperate for a father figure that she kind of overlooks his extreme methods and sort of he takes her under his tutelage. Another important theme is the theme of terrorism. This is a hot button subject in the United States. We've been the subject of a lot of terrorist attacks and things like that. The most memorable being, of course, 9/11. So it's not a term that has any positive connotation, and nor should it really. And yet, this text has this anti-hero with terrorist tendencies that you find yourself sympathizing with in some way, which is a very strange phenomenon. And I really like to get to the bottom of that. So terrorism is the use of extreme tactics, including violence, to generate fear in the hopes that it will further a given political agenda. So the character V wears a Guy Fawkes mask, which is a reference to a 15th century English. He's a terrorist. His name was Guy Fawkes, and he tried, in the name of the restoration of Catholicism to England, attempted on the 5th of November to blow up the British Houses of Parliament using many barrels of gunpowder. So the mask that V wears to cover his true face is a mask of this historical figure which actually existed and actually attempted what is known as the gunpowder treason. He was caught, arrested, and publicly hung for his crimes, but he became a martyr for a lot of the people who wanted to see Catholicism restored to England. And so there's a Guy Fawkes Day, which is the 5th of November, and there's also certain popular cultural maxims like "penny for the guy," which we see coming up in reference to him. So he became a martyr, and by creating a sympathetic anti-hero with terrorist intentions, the text is intentionally trying to disturb your sensibilities. Why are you being made to feel sympathetic towards someone who embraces such horrible extremes? What effect does that generate? And even today, the Guy Fawkes mask, due to its popularization by certain political groups such as the Anonymous Hacker Group, the Guy Fawkes mask has become a symbol of global political insurrection and is very popular today. You've probably seen it before and will recognize it once you see it in the text. We do need to talk again. We talked about this some in Fight Club, but really through a mainly negative lens, and I think that that's very justified because of some of the extreme tactics advocated by anarchists. But by definition, V is an anarchist. And anarchism is the idea that there should not be formal hierarchies in society. And in order to achieve this effect, society should be broken down, that you should perturb and try to destroy the institutions and all this stuff so that you can rebuild in the image of some society that does not contain formal hierarchies. So anarchists argue that, like in tribal societies, which is what most of human history was conducted in, there aren't really any formal hierarchies. Sometimes there's like a chieftain or a shaman or something like that. But really, there are no like state institutions of power. There's no president. There's no So it's very much a hierarchy exists, but it's not a formal one. It's one that sort of arises based on, in many cases, merit or strength or smarts or that kind of thing. And they advocate for a return to this on a scale of society as it exists today. It's very unlikely that that's even possible, but that is what they want to do. So I assign these texts not to advocate any of these ideologies. I just want to talk about them. But I see a lot of breakdown in our society, and more importantly, I see a lot of people who have similar intentions to that of the anarchists, and people who want to perturb society so that they can build it back up in a way that they see suitable. And so I like to include this text in conversation with Fight Club so that we can get two different takes on this very complex subject. While Fight Club suggests that the anarchistic impulse is a byproduct of a generation of wayward man-children, V for Vendetta takes a much more idealistic approach and seems to glorify this concept. While I do not condone any political ideology which advocates radical extremes in this manner, I think reading these texts in conversation with one another can explain both the motivations behind and the potential consequences of adopting this kind of mindset. By reading them, you can understand the thought process behind those movements which advocate for social and political upheaval. This text is much more idealistic in its take. And what I mean by idealistic is, if you're idealistic, it means you have an idea of what the perfect manner of conduct is, and you hold society in judgment of that ideal, and you want to try to realize that ideal and make it manifest in the world and change the world, right? There are a lot of different types of idealists, but we might describe V as a anarchist idealist. He has this ideal view of what society should be like, and so he wants to try to destroy or perturb the society so that that view of his vision can be realized, not by himself, but by the people who inevitably will have to choose it of their own accord. So, when we compare, there's very little idealism in Fight Club is very negatively portrayed. It's almost like a sickness that Tyler Durden has. But this character V, his idealism is kind of celebrated, and so we can kind of see, like, get inside the mind of an idealist. How do they function? How do they operate? How do they view the world? Why? What is their motivation? What are they doing? Why? Is it just, as Fight Club suggests, like adolescent angst and a want to destroy, or is this somehow more complicated than that? Is there a real vision behind this? And what does that vision matter? Does it matter if you have an ideal, if the ideal can never be realized? I think it's a very interesting subject, especially in a conversation of political upheaval. The Fate supercomputer. So there is this computer in the story that's like controlling the entire society. And this was written in the 90s, before we really had smartphones or any of this stuff or AI. And so I think they did a pretty good job based on what they had available at the time of constructing an idea of what a technologically controlled society might look like. But of course, their imagination was limited, and we see now that it's actually the potential for abuse and control of technology is actually way higher, I think, than not only that is proposed in this text, V for Vendetta, but also which is proposed by Fight Club. I think we have, with smartphones, with social media, with algorithmic manipulation, with data collection, with governments, spying on other governments and their own citizens and all this stuff, we're looking at a technological dystopia that I don't think these people had the ability to predict. But the Fate supercomputer is kind of a representation of that. And so I think it's an interesting thing to include. The Fate supercomputer is comprised of 5 body parts: the ear, nose, eye, mouth, and finger. All of these components control the society, and the citizens even believe that the computer itself is conscious and that it has a voice. They think that the voice of Fate delivers the news broadcast to them every night. Of course, we know that this is not really the case, but it's actually Louis Prothero that delivers the news broadcast every night. But they don't know that, and by thinking that it's alive, it gives legitimacy to this supercomputer and its function in society. They want to treat it basically like an artificial god that they've created, which is kind of interesting. Are we heading towards a reality that's ruled by technology and AI? And the character in the story, Chancellor Susan, seems to be in love with Fate, in love with the computer, which is weird because he can't seem to love anyone else in his life. And I wonder, is technology doing this to us? are we becoming like Chancellor Susan, in love with our phones, in love with our social media personalities, and is it affecting our ability to relate to one another? Because Chancellor Susan, he really doesn't even have any friends. Not only does he not have, it's implied that he's a virgin. He doesn't have any real relationships, no family, and no friends. But he's in love with this computer, and he's in love with what the computer represents, which for him is total control and power, in accordance with the fascist intentions. So one of the final themes, and there are more themes in this, but these are the ones that I could think of to really comment on. The function of religion as a state apparatus. Now, there is a criticism of religion in this text, but I always like to clarify, because I think the distinction that the religion in the text is a state religion is an important one to make. Because we don't have in the United States state religions. If you know about the freedom of religion and the First Amendment and all that stuff, we have that in place because the early colonialists many of them were trying to escape the oppression of the Anglican Church, which was the state religion of England, particularly the Puritans, the Pilgrims that we see on people's table at Thanksgiving. They were fleeing the tyranny of the Anglican Church, which, even though they were Protestants, and they were their own thing. I mean, technically Anglicans are Protestants too, but even though they were like part of a sort of rebellious spiritual movement, they were still forced to pay the tithe to the Anglican Church, and in many cases they were forced to attend and things like that. So the idea of religion as a institution of state power is something that is kind of alien to the American mentality, but it is nevertheless something which exists in a lot of places all over the world. And so it's something to point out. The character Bishop Lilliman is absolutely gross. He preys on underage girls and stuff like that. He's a terrible, terrible human being. But he also is part of the government. He basically works for Chancellor Susan as like a agent of propaganda. And we can see that he really doesn't even believe his own religious ideology. He really just believes in fascism, and he functions as a corrupt mouthpiece for the fascist state. So, there's some commentary there about institutions of control and organized religion and things like that. And I think it's worth pointing out. Okay. This was originally going to be one long video, but my kid is acting really squirrely right now. So I'm going to take a break and break it down into a couple of videos, try to get him calmed down a little bit. So please stand by. Thank you very much.